It didn't happen anywhere near us, and most of us didn't know any of the victims. But what happened in Newtown, Connecticut, at Sandy Hook Elementary School, is more than just a national news story. It's a national tragedy, because all over the country, what happened there hits close to home. So like a lot of communities tonight, we're talking about Newtown, because people feel things need to be said, and maybe things need to be done. We have a wide variety of guests and points of view tonight, so please join us for this Stay Tuned special.
Good evening and welcome to Stay Tuned. First, what we won't do tonight, what we can't do. We can't make sense of the murders in Newtown. We can't find one old policy to blame or one new policy to promise it won't happen again. But what we hope to do is to use the fear, the sadness, the anger that we feel now as a catalyst to talk about how we can make sure all of our children are healthy and safe before we forget how we feel. So stay tuned.
With the Newtown massacre at Sandy Hook School just about a week behind us now, the coverage has evolved. The reactions and conversations have begun to focus, changing from simply raw emotions of sorrow, disbelief, and outrage to issues and questions about gun control, mental health, school safety,
whether or not we need assault-type weapons on the street, or whether or not they should.
And broader issues, the role of the media, a culture of violence.
Saved many human lives. I can tell you it broke.
And it seems that this tragedy is perhaps a tipping point, not just another mass killing, but one that demands some kind of response.
Does the president think that he needs to capitalize on this, get this conversation going, and see some action in the short?
There have been disasters that, for one reason or another, have focused the country on particular problems and solutions. In the 1930s, there were plenty of plane crashes. But the 1934 crash outside Kirksville, Missouri got more attention than most. A U.S. senator was among its victims, and the crash prompted congressional inquiries, hearings, and investigations, which determined that there was inadequate weather forecasting, poor communications, and a faulty guidance system. Findings that would lead to greater federal control over aviation, tougher rules and regulations, and safer air travel. But of course, it did not bring the end of plane crashes. For others, the loss of so many innocent lives in Newtown brought to mind the 1958 Our Lady of Angels fire in Chicago. 92 students and 3 nuns perished. And just like the Sandy Hook shootings, a community, a nation mourned and looked for answers, someone or something to blame, something that could be done. A boy had started the fire, but the real focus would be on the building, the lack of protection for all those kids, the flammable materials, the lack of fire doors and fire escapes, sprinklers, a fire code that just wasn't tough enough. And after the investigation, a fire safety official said there were no new lessons, just old lessons that went unheeded. But across the country, school buildings were changed, especially the old ones, and codes and enforcement were toughened.
That you're not alone in your grief. That our world too has been torn apart.
Every tragedy has a unique and complex combination of factors and circumstances, but over time what really distinguishes some of them is the reaction, making them not just another plane crash or another fire or another mass killing. These are the tragedies when the nation doesn't just hurt, but changes because of it.
That was Jim Kircher reporting, and Jim joins us now and will throughout the night. The way we approached this week's show was really with a sense of urgency and really all hands on deck here at the 9 Network. So Jim, we appreciate you being here and bringing your expertise and your experience to tonight's show.
Yeah, we're going to be covering such a lot of ground, certainly gun control, mental health issues, that difficult connection between mental health and violence. We've got national experts, we've got local educators, and, you know, Chief Fitch is here, and the comments that he has made have gotten a lot of response, so I'm really interested in hearing that interview. And
a lot of what we're doing tonight has been informed already by you this week on social media. We want that to continue tonight. And here to tell us how that will happen, Mr. Ed Reggie. Ed.
Thanks, Casey. Well, there's been so much conversation on social media already about this tragedy, and what more can we say? Well, we want to hear from you. We want to hear about your voice. What can you add to the conversation? Well, we actually asked this week on social media what you can add, and the information we received and the questions that you answered really helped frame tonight's show. And throughout the show, we'll be using it, your conversations, to help frame the show. So there's several ways you can get involved. We actually posted on our Facebook page a question earlier today. We want you to go on Facebook, the 9 Network, and we want you to respond. And maybe if you have a question with one of the community guests tonight, we want you to pose that question there on Facebook. Or you can actually follow the conversation using the hashtag StayTunedSTL on Twitter. We want to hear from you. What personal stories can you add? What's missing to tonight's conversation? We want you to help frame the conversation.
I want to introduce to you who we are being joined with by here tonight at our first conversation at the table. I'm joined by Nancy Fowler with the St. Louis Beacon, Moisey Shopper, a child psychiatrist.
And psychoanalyst.
And psychoanalyst, thank you very much. And Norm White with St. Louis University, a criminologist with St. Louis University. We have you here because you were all kind of interconnected in something Nancy worked on this week. Nancy, you wrote an article. You know, I think sometimes after a tragedy is almost overused this past week, but after a tragedy like this, we kind of grasp for a narrative, and we want to say, oh, well, there was a mental health issue involved, and all of a sudden we can kind of relax a little bit. Maybe somehow that makes sense in our minds. But the title of your article was The Difficult Relationship Between Mental Health and Violence. What did you find in working for the Beacon on this article? What makes that relationship so difficult?
Well, the shooter, alleged shooter in the Connecticut tragedy, was not known to have any particular diagnosis, but yet these kinds of horrific occurrences always, of course, have a mental health component and raise that issue. So we thought it was important to take a look at that, and to start, we looked at. There are some dangers of actually even associating these two issues, violence and mental health, because
do the two overlap often? I mean, there are a lot of people struggling, dealing with mental health issues that are not violent, and a lot of violence that has nothing to do with mental health.
That's exactly right. I mean, from what I'm told by people that work in the mental health field, and the two of you, that actually it's a very small percentage of violence that is committed by people with mental health issues.
Is that a dangerous area that when we start grasping for that narrative right there? Is the overlap pretty small?
I think we're looking for something to make us comfortable, to try and make sense of the senseless. In this case, it was such a struggle to deal with the gravity of this incident that it's hard to say anything other than he had to be crazy. And that's where we began our conversation.
And I'm referencing back to the article Nancy wrote. I mean, is mental health like physical health? I mean, should we be treating things early and preventing? If I get on the treadmill now, I may not have a heart attack later in life. Are there those kind of comparisons?
I think you're talking about treating. I would prefer to talk about prevention. In other words, if you have a stable relationship in your family with a parent, single parent or double parent or extended family, even better. But that is basic to mental health, is to have this kind of stable, unwavering, loving relationship with a parent. And many kids don't have that. They have it disrupted by one thing or another, and as a result, their mental health is endangered.
Why don't people seek help for themselves, or, as you're talking, for their children?
We don't encourage people to talk about mental health.
We don't encourage people.
No, we run away from the issue of mental health. The picture, and this is, again, in the conversation I had with Nancy, when we think about violence and mental health, we think of the joke or the riddle, or we think about people that are just so beyond the pale. There are a lot of people who are experiencing mental health issues or problems on a daily basis in urban America. My focus is on communities and crime. And the kinds of experiences, the stresses that kids deal with on a daily basis would require at some point that we need to pay attention to their mental health, but we don't have resources. There's not enough insurance. There's not enough access to the resources in the community. It becomes a challenge.
And do you see the same with the stigma? When you're reporting or in your work, is there the stigma that is preventing treatment?
It used to be quite great that if you were seeing a shrink, you were very sick, and you kept it to yourself and you didn't talk about it. In the past 20, 30 years, that has changed. People talk about their analysts, their treatment, what they're doing for their mental health, and a whole batch of alternative therapies in mental health have developed, and some of them are nonsense and some of them are very good. But there's a lot more openness than there used to be, and especially among the newer generation. They don't see it with as much stigmata as their parents do. But it's still not a very popular thing. Let's put it that way. It's not like getting your shots for the flu.
Do you see? No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I think that there's a difference in terms of who's having that conversation. That it's not something that's comfortable to talk about in poor communities, poor urban communities. That, you know, I'm talking about my analyst and I'm dealing with my analyst, and, you know, I have this diagnosis. That's not common. In fact, it's less likely that they'll seek out that help. I was working with the health department last summer, and they had done some focus groups with kids, and they asked them, where would you go to get the resources you need if you had a health problem, a mental health kind of issue, or needed counseling? And those kids said that they would go to the juvenile detention center or jail. That's not the place you get resources for a health problem. In order to get in there, you have to self-nominate by getting arrested. So now you're criminal as opposed to being unhealthy in terms of your psychological well-being. Those are issues that we have to take on.
What can we do in some of these communities?
Can I add something?
I'm sorry?
Those kids who have to grow up unattended by good parenting, often develop a sense of reliance on themselves and then reliance on their age mates, called gangs. And for them to go and seek help by anyone or with anyone goes counter to the sense of, I can make it on my own, I have the resources. And it's an affront to their sense of competence to be asking for, quote, mental health help.
So what can be done?
Many people avoid it.
What can be done in these communities and to ease that stigma and to make it a more acceptable, even, you know, a good thing to seek help? I think
rather than easing stigmata, you ought to provide better resources for families, which means communities, schools, recreational programs, art and music programs. Nowadays, when a school is in trouble, what do they cut? They cut the music, and they cut the art, and they give more money to the football coach.
And we said in the beginning, we're talking about all children. You know, we are hyper-focused when we have a mass shooting, but and again, I want to be careful here. I'm not trying to do what we talked about we shouldn't there and make some sort of loose connection between mental health and violence. But there are problems that are claiming the lives of children all the time. Is there something that we're missing by only focusing our attention when something massive and dramatic like this happens?
I think that we do a disservice, because what the conversation has been about in terms of mental health and violence in the last week has been about, you know, the more severe mental illness. And if that's what it takes to get attention, then we don't deal with kind of the root causes and the progression to that unhealthy state. When I was on, right after we had done this interview the other day, I had a student come into my office and we were going to talk about a project we're working on, and she was crying, and I asked her what was going on, and her response was that a friend of her sister's had just committed suicide. This is 4 days before Christmas, or maybe it's 5 days. That young woman had to have been going through some psychological distress that you don't see in the conversations we're having right now. And those are the kids we have to help. We have to help young people who just don't see solutions to very challenging worlds that they live in.
If you know of someone, if you're in a position to be with kids and you see someone who's very troubled, what steps should you take first? I mean, where should you send them for help?
Well, you should talk with their parents first. You can't send a kid just because you say so.
Right.
You need parental cooperation. They need to have an understanding as to what the problem is as you see it, and what significance you attach to that problem, and then what resources are available to them in their community, or what resources are available, period. And sometimes, you know, the resources are not very good.
Thank you all for your time. I appreciate it. A lot to discuss tonight based on this conversation here, so we appreciate it. Earlier today, we had a chance to get some perspective from Newtown when Jim spoke with Hari Srinivasan from the PBS NewsHour.
Hari, you're just back from Newtown. I guess you were there for a few days. Just some quick impressions of how that community is doing, and really the impressions on you as you tried to cover this story.
You know, there are a lot of different people that have converged on that town, whether it's the aid workers, obviously the press. I mean, we're talking about a very small town of 27,000. That's Newtown, but when you look at the borough of Sandy Hook, it's even much, much smaller, and you add 500 to 1,000 journalists all swarmed around in that area. It's incredibly chaotic on some level, because you see all of these people there that are trying to make sense of it. You see the press there trying to take the story and distribute it further. And then really at the center of it all are these people who are just in unimaginable grief. And it's palpable. It's every person that you talk to in the town. This is such a small area that they knew either directly the children or one of the faculty members that was shot.
Newtown only knows what did happen.
The children?
During our interview with Lillian Bittman, the list of those killed became official.
Just read me last name.
This isn't going to be nice.
Don't you film this.
Okay. You knew at least a half a dozen of these people, these victims, personally.
Mm-hmm. Now we get to work. Now we support them. We do what we can. We bring them meals. We give them hugs. We love them. We take their other kids if they have any and help them with, I mean, we do whatever we can. We just help.
Help that will be necessary for Newtown, Connecticut to heal.
Do you have a sense yet, communities like ours, I mean, one of the reasons we're doing this program is for that same reason. Do you have a sense that this is affecting, impacting the rest of the country in a similar way, not certainly as direct as the folks who suffered through this, but impacting it in a way that perhaps the movie theater shooting did not?
You know, that's a good question. I think that one of the reasons this story seems more universal and broad, it's because they're all children. It's because that there's, regardless of what culture, what country you come from, it's an unequivocal atrocity. And it's something that's part of the reason why the international media descended on Sandy Hook and Newtown. And so I think that there are a lot of people that set their politics aside and they just start to think as parents. You know, across the board, you can find people at different ends of the political spectrum that can say, you know what, here's a reasonable policy in the middle that might be able to help make sure that this doesn't happen again, whether it's increasing school security, or whether it's increasing funding for X or Y. And even in the conversation that I had for the NewsHour a couple of nights ago with about 5 different residents, I mean, 3 of them said, hey, listen, banning guns is not what we're talking about. That's not what we're asking for. What we're saying is that there has to be some sort of common sense middle ground that we can meet at here.
I support responsible gun ownership. I've gone to firing ranges. I've fired guns. I don't own a gun. I would be happy to listen to responsible gun owners as well. I don't support banning all guns. Just weapons that can just keep shooting and shooting and shooting.
And it may not just be the guns. It might also be the ammunition. I mean, the fact that this boy was able to shoot more than 100 rounds in a short amount of time, something's wrong. Why is there that much ammunition out there? Maybe we need to do more in terms of legislation, in terms of tracking, in terms of what's happening in this household. There's a lot of ammo being sold to this household.
And gun culture is very embedded in American life. It's not very easy to just say, well, I think that, you know, we can just wish away weapon X, or we can wish away behavior Y. So this is going to be a nuanced conversation, but what's interesting is that towns like Newtown could actually create a template for how other communities could have these conversations. Perhaps on programs like the one we're talking on now is where people can meet and start to say, okay, I see your point of view, but can we meet somewhere halfway?
You know, I haven't really researched this, but it seems to me that after Columbine, there were changes that took place. It wasn't just a tragedy that we all remember, but a lot of schools began to address this, a lot of communities began to address this. And I wonder if we've forgotten that that had some impact on this country as well, beyond the initial shock of the tragedy.
You know, one of the things that was interesting to me when you say that is that when I started looking around and talking to different school administrators, schools, people who were familiar with not just the Sandy Hook school, but they would say to me, yeah, well, we've trained for this. We had drills for this. That is an effect of Columbine. That, you know, when I went to school, we trained for earthquakes. That was kind of radical for me. But
or air raids when I was in school, you know.
You're right, there are impacts that Columbine has had, and now is there something that this community can do? Are there pieces of legislation that this spurs? Does Vice President Biden take this opportunity, and the president themselves, to say, we really have got to do some, as they say, quote unquote, meaningful impact? Well, what is that meaningful impact? And, you know, there's lots of folks, we've had them on the NewsHour who, you know, disagree about what the right course is to move forward. Everyone can agree that this is a tragedy. Not so many people can agree on what the right steps to take are.
Hari, thanks for your hard work on covering this story and taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us tonight. Hari Srinivasan from PBS NewsHour.
Kids always have a lot of questions. Sometimes we adults can answer them, and sometimes they leave us scratching our heads. Especially after events like what happened in Newtown, Connecticut, it's important to talk, listen, and respond to kids during difficult times. And PBS.org offers ways to get that conversation started. To access the Parent's Guide to Talking to Kids About Everything, please visit pbs.org/parents.
We want to expand this conversation away just from that particular incident, that particular young man, and those particular victims. We've got Michael Meehan from the Good Shepherd Family Services, Dave Hilliard from Wyman Center, Kira Hudson-Banks, a psychologist from St. Louis University. Let's talk about what Newtown has to do with what you guys do, or what issues are being raised for you. I mean, you get the same questions that we're addressing tonight. You know, what was wrong, what happened, this and that, but broaden it out. What should we be talking about? What does it have to do with what you do at Good Shepherd?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of things that need to be done. One, you have a community in mourning, and you have a community that's terribly frightened. And unfortunately, these sort of horrible circumstances are exceedingly rare. But when they happen, they deal a really difficult blow, and in this case, to the whole country. And so we've got kids who are afraid, we've got families who are afraid, we've got people who just don't know what to do. They're overwhelmed. They want to know who they can talk to and what to do. And so conversation is what we need.
Does the kind of conversation that we're having today, or the conversations that maybe people have brought up with you folks, how helpful is that just to raise some of those issues in a time like this?
I think it's always important to raise the issue, to think about the larger dynamics that are at play when a crisis like this happens. But for me, what I think about is the importance of helping kids have an emotional vocabulary, to be able to process large emotions, right? To be able to manage when any crisis happens. So what do we need to be doing? I think we need to be thinking about the emotional wellness of our children and what we can do every day as parents or as teachers or as community leaders to help to bolster their ability to navigate emotions.
I mean, in a sense, we're talking in this greater sense of mental health, Dave, not just because we want to prevent these tragedies, which are in many cases aberrations. We don't exactly know how they happened, but what beyond that in terms of the greater well-being of kids, not just the victims, not just the shooter, but kids in general, because most kids who have problems are not going to be killed or be killers, but they've got other issues that they've got to deal with.
Sure. Well, you know, from looking at it through the lens of youth development, and we work specifically with adolescents, but I think there's a whole continuum of developmental needs that we have to think about. I like to think in these kinds of circumstances about a couple of things. One, I think you have to stop. You have to take care of yourself and the people who've been victimized and the people who care for the people who victimized. And I think it's really important to step back from the moment and reflect so that you're not making decisions, policy decisions or action decisions in the moment of high emotion and high tension. I think that's very important. And I think that's something we can model to our children. So as children see how adults respond, they take their cues from that. The second thing I think we need to think about then, as we reflect, is what's the real big question we should be asking here? We're having a conversation now about guns and violence and media and mental health. There's a larger question that we should be asking ourselves, and that is, how do we create a safe and civil society for ourselves and for our kids to grow in? And I think that's where you want to press on policy and on programs. And so from the program space, the conversations are really, how do we create communities that are supportive of children and one another? How do we make sure every young person has access to a caring and competent adult in their life who helps guide them through moments of crises, through their personal challenges, whether those are just developmental challenges or whether they're issues of health? How do we create the caregivers, the youth workers and the teachers and the neighbors to understand and recognize what good mental health is and what the indicators are of poor mental health and what to do about that?
Do you agree that these are some, what kinds of bigger questions should we be asking? Because some of the details we don't really get a sense that they're relevant to our lives every day. Maybe they are, but how are they maybe?
Well, I think we've got to think about those larger questions. I was just thinking about the fact that we oftentimes want to talk about the tragedy, but we don't want to think about what caused it, right? And there was an analogy when you think about systems. If you have somebody who's throwing, for example, children down the way in terms of the water, you want people coming out to help save the children. But you also want someone to say, hey, who's sending children down the river, right? And so I think we have to step back and ask, are we creating children that have mindfulness skills or are able to be self-aware enough to know when their emotions they aren't able to manage them, how to ask for help, who to go to?
You know, we ask these questions a lot. Are we improving the situation? I mean, we've been talking about this for years and years and years. Help me out here. Tell me that, in fact, a lot of these issues are being dealt with better than they were 10 or 20 years ago.
Yeah, I think we're doing better. I think in our local community in particular, we're moving in the right direction. We've got We have programs, we have local communities, the St. Louis County Children's Services Fund, and the St. Louis Mental Health Board of Trustees, and we've gotten together, local communities, to say, you know, this is important to us. We want to fund services. We want to make them available to everybody so that children and families have the services they need. You know, the issue really is, you know, the wonderful news is kids are incredibly resilient. They're strong. The trajectory for most kids, even kids who've been through trauma, even kids who've been through abuse, is that they turn out really normal.
Yeah. But I do think there's a way in which we love the soundbite, and we love to rush to what can we do today, and that we don't do a great job of stopping and pausing and reflecting and thinking big picture about what next steps we should be taking.
And there's skill development, and I think we do much better now at understanding. I think the Academy has helped us understand what are the skills that our young people need to be able to communicate effectively, to be able to resolve conflict, to have civil discourse, to have a debate or a difference of opinion.
And maybe being more aware, whether you're teachers or parents or youth leaders, of anger, isolation, victimization, all of those things, which I think we're way more aware of now than we used to be.
But even as parents or teachers, helping kids to create an emotional vocabulary so that they literally know how to...
What do you mean by that exactly?
So to be able to say, I am upset, or even to recognize in yourself. I'll give an example. I worked with a young woman who was 18, pre-engineering, on paper, extracurriculars, doing fabulous, but she was struggling and she was throwing up. And it wasn't that she had an eating disorder. Her emotions got so big that she felt full and had to, felt like she had to expel it. And we worked, and she wasn't even aware that she was feeling anxious or upset or nervous. And as we worked together to label and name, oh, you're feeling sad right now. Maybe you should take a moment and listen to your favorite song. Or maybe you should talk to your best friend. She was able to catch her emotions before they got to a 10, before she felt she had no option. So that's what I mean in terms of helping kids label, name, navigate what they're feeling.
And to use your analogy, I think part of it is going upriver and helping parents nurture those kinds of skills in their parenting. And making sure that parents have the resources that are needed to be the kinds of wonderful parents that they want to be. And so they model and they coach and they provide an environment in which kids can talk about it, can explore, and can build these sort of skill sets.
And we know, for example, it's not just kids who don't have parents in the house. I mean, it's a question of having maybe one person that they are able to connect to, right?
Right, and so as we think of, as our kids leave the home and move into school settings and community-based settings, as they age, they're spending more and more time away from the home. And we can't stop the developmental process. And so those are the contexts. We want to make sure that our schools are equipped to provide social emotional learning supports for kids, that our youth serving agencies really understand this much deeper role and help kids learn that.
We're going to be talking to some folks from schools, but Dave, you mentioned the culture change, and I was thinking culture change in some ways sounds like climate change. Some people would rather improve the structures so that they can withstand the tornado than think about the debate over whether there's anything you can do to change that. Culture of violence. Well, we also have a culture of love and peace as well. I mean, I don't know if we live in totally a culture of violence, but when you talk culture change, it just seems like, whoa, let's just build a stronger building so we can withstand the next storm.
But I think there's something really important in terms of child development. They shouldn't have to withstand a storm of chaos, and so the example I gave of that young woman, she had two parents at home, they were an affluent family, right? So this issue of really learning how to be a full, emotionally healthy person knows no socioeconomics, race, anything. It's about being a whole person. And I think there are times that we don't stop to think about what does it take to nurture and foster that in children. We just hope that they will, but in times we don't create the environment.
Children don't come with instruction manuals, and if parents haven't had those kinds of developmental experiences and acquired those skills themselves, then it's much tougher. And we can't lose sight of the fact that many of our children, particularly those in poverty and stressful circumstances, are living in circumstances of crises and violence in domestic senses and in neighborhood senses, every bit as extreme as what we've just experienced in a mass level. And we have to be cognizant of that, and we have to help those kids develop the skills, both coping, but the skills for moving beyond that.
Yeah, we have neighborhoods where youth are dying every day. There's that gun violence is the leading cause of death for young African American males, for instance, 15 to 34. That's happening every day. That's not a mass murder. That's every single day in urban areas throughout our country.
Great, thanks.
And so that's a big change.
Yeah, we'll be talking. We've got lots more to talk about tonight. Michael Meehan, Dave Hilliard, Kira Hudson-Banks. Thanks for coming.
Now we're going to go outside the studio to Yale University via Google+. We are joined tonight by Dr. Mark Brackett, who is the director of the Health, Emotion, and Behavior Laboratory at Yale. And Doctor, I think we're going to have a chance to really kind of expand on what we just heard there at the table. You developed something called the ruler approach in terms of another phrase called emotional literacy, I guess. Can you first kind of get us up to speed on what is the ruler, because that's something educators in the audience might be aware of because it's used across the country. Kind of explain to us what that is and what emotional literacy is.
Sure. Well, let me start off by saying the lab that I now direct, called the Health, Emotion, and Behavior Laboratory, really believes that our nation has been remiss in providing children with a solid emotion education. And so when we think about what is an emotion education, we've developed something that we call the ruler approach, and ruler stands for 5 critical skills. The first is teaching kids and the adults involved in their education how to recognize emotions. So what are the emotions that I am feeling versus the emotion that the other person is feeling? That's the R. The U is teaching them to understand where these emotions came from, what we call the understanding of emotion. The L is giving them that rich vocabulary so they can describe that full range of emotion. And then the next letter is E in ruler, and that has to do with the expression of emotion. And finally, and probably most importantly, what we want to do is teach children and adults the strategies for regulating emotions. So in essence, ruler is about recognizing, understanding, labeling, expressing, and regulating emotion.
So that's something that's important for the kids. How important is it for the adults to be able to do for themselves and for the kids?
So our belief and the way we bring our programs to school systems is that we have to bring the adults on board first. That adults have to have the belief system that emotions matter, that they're important for student thinking, that they're important for student learning, that they're important for students' mental health and the relationships that they have. And when we can shift teachers and school leaders' belief systems, we have just so much more success in schools.
How important is their individual health, the educator, the parents? How important is that in the mental health of the kids, the emotional health of the kids?
Yes, so just like your other presenters earlier, speakers, we really believe strongly that the adults have to model healthy emotional responses to situations. So if the adult doesn't have the strategies to regulate his or her emotions, it's going to be very difficult for that person, whether it be a parent or a teacher, to teach those skills effectively to children.
Okay, speaking of strategies, can you give us adults some strategies on how to help our kids, how to recognize, how to help them, in addition to modeling for them?
Sure. So we take it to a deeper level by providing what we call tools, or anchor tools, to our program. One tool, for example, is called the Mood Meter. And what that tool does is it provides a platform for children to plot their emotions, to understand if they're feeling very pleasant or unpleasant, or if they have lots of energy or lower amounts of energy. Mm-hmm. And then they convert that into a word so that they can become more emotionally literate, as you said earlier.
Your proximity to Newtown is what, maybe 45 minutes or so from where you are? I'm curious if, have you seen any ripple effects in your community with kids or with the adults?
Yeah, I mean, I think our nation has been hit by this. And first I want to say that our hearts go out to the children and adults who lost their lives, and to the teachers and children and families in Newtown. And obviously the emotions that arise from these kinds of tragedies are overwhelming, they're complex, they're ever-changing. Today I was in a local school district, and they had canceled all their professional development because teachers were just overwhelmed by their own emotions. And again, that speaks to the real importance to making sure that we are training the adults that are involved in our children's education these critical, as we say, ruler skills.
So what would you like to make sure that is in the conversation? As we're talking tonight, we're using this as a catalyst to talk about the well-being of all of our children. The probabilities are not great that this will happen to one of our kids. It's, you know, when you do the math, it's less than Powerball. But what do you hope is in this conversation?
What we hope is that we can provide instructional strategies and tools to schools to create an emotionally healthy climate so that children do feel safe and welcome in school, and that there's nothing strange about talking about your feelings. So the last thing we'd want either adults or children to do is to suppress their feelings when it comes to a tragedy like this. We need to create environments where children feel safe and valued and welcome to talk about their feelings, and where adults also have systems in place to have the opportunity to talk about their feeling states and learn from each other and support each other.
Easier said than done, some parents might say, in different communities, depending on what their struggles they're up against. Encourage parents and encourage educators. What are some small steps they can take to see that happening? Because, you know, a lot of parents are maybe working 2 minimum wage jobs, and they don't have the time to go to the doctor with their child, and unless something's bleeding or they're not breathing.
Well, I always say to my friends and family members, if someone calls you up and they say, I'm having a really bad day, you don't hang up the phone on them. What you do is you say, you know, tell me more, you know, talk to me. So we have to just create the space for children and adults to talk about their feelings and not react to it as if it's something strange. Because in our model and the way we do our work in schools is we preach that all emotions are valid. So anger is real, and sadness, of course, and devastation and despair in the current situation is real. And we shouldn't ask children to hide those feelings or suppress them. We should give them the opportunity to talk, give them the right words to have that conversation, and very importantly, give them the strategies that they need to regulate it effectively so they can live a healthy life.
Did what you saw in Newtown change any of your thinking, or change any of your approaches, or shake any of your foundations about what you believe, or anything like that? I don't know. Are you a different professional now in any way?
Yeah, of course. You know, we're all affected by this, and it's hard to even process what happened. But you know, in many ways, we just feel more strongly about schools taking the kind of work that we do seriously. We just want to make sure that, again, the children have the skills they need to navigate their personal lives, their academic lives, their home lives. And what we do know is that there has been no formal institution for this kind of training. You know, we know that if you want to play an instrument, you can go take a course. If you want to take karate, you get a yellow belt, then a black belt. But where do you get a black belt in emotional intelligence? And our job is to make sure that every child gets the emotion education that he or she deserves.
Dr. Mark Brackett from Yale, we appreciate your time and your insight. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we're going to continue to talk about how some of these issues are dealt with in schools with 3 folks who deal with these issues in and out of schools. Pat Holterman-Homus is with Youth in Need. She's the Chief Program Officer. It's a nonprofit child and family services agency. Dr. Kelly Morton is principal at Barrett's Elementary School in Parkway. And Sheila Powell-Walker, care team member at Riverview Gardens. Dr. Morton, I guess first sense is that as an elementary school principal, I can't imagine the reaction, not only just you personally, but among the teachers and the parents and the kids.
It's been a heartbreaking week for everyone. It's not something that any of us can really wrap our minds around, but I can tell you that Monday felt good when school opened and the kids came back, and our children are resilient. They came to school Monday and they didn't miss a beat. It was business as usual. They got right back into their routines. That comforted the staff, and I know it comforted their parents.
Let's talk about this issue of, kids and their emotions. I don't mean just in response to this, but in a general sense, in an everyday situation. I think there is a recognition, there must be a recognition among good teachers and principals and social workers and such, of just the importance early on of recognizing the importance of those kids' emotions and where they might begin to go a little astray, if I'm putting that correctly.
I would say that any classroom teacher, any administrator, parents, anyone who is around a child on a daily basis that we are, our eyes are always open, our ears are always open. We notice those things and we try and be proactive. Conversations, we try and build very strong classroom communities where our students feel accepted and they feel able to share what they might be going through, whether it's a good day, a bad day. So we try and put those types of things and systems in place in our classrooms every day so that we are able to notice and have that open door and that safe feeling for children if they are needing to have help dealing with something, that they can go to a trusted adult and ask for that help.
Yeah, and I guess a teacher or principal can't do everything, and I guess a care team coordinator is somebody who looks outside the school. Can you kind of walk me through a process of how something that might be identified would be dealt with a kid in I don't know, in almost any grade, I suppose, or maybe it changes from age to age?
Okay, in the Riverview Gardens School District, each of our buildings has a school care team. Our school care teams are made up of classroom teachers, school counselors, school social workers, and oftentimes special school district staff and members of the mental health community who choose to come and sit at the table with us. What we depend on our classroom teachers to do, because they are the front line, are to notice behavioral changes in our children and to make the necessary referral to the school counselors so that more investigation can be done. And you've been a school counselor? I've been a school counselor. I've been a school social worker as well.
Yeah. What kinds of things would commonly be flagged or looked at among kids?
I would think that you would be talking about a child who is having some chronic difficulties with being able to be settled during the school day, able to function in a manner that would allow them to access the learning environment, meaning maybe a student who's having some chronic office referrals, lots of intervention with that child outside of the classroom and in the classroom. And so I would think that that classroom teacher needs to take some steps to intervene on that child's behalf. There may be some intervention that the teacher can provide in the classroom setting, but certainly once that teacher recognizes that this is beyond the scope of what I can manage, then they need to bring in other professionals such as the school counselor and the school social worker for support.
Yeah, Pat, how does an organization like Youth in Need fit into this picture?
So Youth in Need, it provides counselors to many of these schools. We have master's level clinicians in 9 school districts in St. Charles County and St. Louis County, where we have clinicians actually embedded in the schools. So as these children are identified and need services, they're immediately linked with a therapist right there at school, which helps with accessibility, right? As was mentioned earlier, a lot of parents have a hard time getting those services because of their work schedules, because of insurance copays and other barriers, transportation. And so the services are available right there at school immediately, and there's less stigma with getting services where you go to school. It's just, kids go to tutoring or they see a speech therapist, so it's very much normalized.
Mm-hmm. The schools still seem to be the center for, it's funny we're talking about this because the school came under attack, and yet it's really the schools that become, in a way, the chief identifier in a sense of even preventing these sorts of things early on. Maybe that's a bit of a stretch, maybe it's not.
Oh, I think that's absolutely true, and I think with these services that with the benefits of the funding resources that were mentioned earlier with the Children's Service Fund and the Mental Health Board, we're really able to saturate the schools in our community with a lot of those services. So I feel like we are helping to prevent some of these tragic situations.
Yeah, and I always like to get to the sense of hope here, because I think we have, as I've said in the previous conversation and other folks have said, I think we have made a lot of progress in these areas. Have you seen progress since you became a counselor and then moved into what you're doing now?
Yes, I do feel like I've seen progress with accessibility to services such as school-based counseling services through Youth in Need. I always say I feel like for some reason the classroom seems to change about every 5 years. Classroom teachers go through various types of professional development and they learn how to manage certain kinds of behaviors, but it seems like every 5 years or so there's some sort of a shift, and then we all have to try to get up to speed again so that we can continue to serve our kids.
Great, and I appreciate all the work you guys are doing, and thanks for coming in tonight and sharing some of your thoughts.
Thanks for having me.
Coming up in just a few minutes, we have Chief Tim Fitch from the St. Louis County Police. He will be joining us here in just a few moments. But before we do that, we're going to go back to Google Hangout and talk to a couple of folks here about kind of the difference between different and dangerous. Joining us, Dr. Kenneth Duckworth. He's a psychiatrist, but the medical director for the National Alliance on Mental Illness. He's also an assistant clinical professor at Harvard University Medical School. And also we have with us an exceptional young woman who has been a pleasure to talk to before the show tonight. This is Savannah Loxton Breakstone, who wrote a blog this week that caught our attention. It was a post on her blog that she's maintained for several years. It was titled, "I was one of the scary kids," emphasis on was, and it was just a very personal account. When I asked you, Savannah, to describe yourself to me earlier, you said autism with an anxiety disorder, and you talked to me a little bit about being what you call a scary kid. I guess first, what do you mean by a scary kid? How long ago was that, and what does that mean?
So, scary kid really isn't defined by diagnosis or anything. It's about behaviors.
Right.
It's usually things that scare other people, like parents or other caregivers. In my case, I was somebody who I didn't have the skills to cope with my emotions or stressors or anxiety. And I mean, I would throw things, I would open the door in a moving car with the intention of jumping out. I would say things that my mother found terrifying. And this was all between the ages of 8 and 14.
So what changed? I know you've talked about your mother and her role in your life.
Yeah, I mean, there's several, things that were really big. I mean, number one is I learned new skills, and one of the more important skills I think that I learned was about self-advocacy and gaining that sense of the sense that I had an ability to have some control over what was happening to me and the way that my life was going. And my mother never gave up on me, and she, at first it started out with she started taking me to meetings because she didn't feel safe leaving me with babysitters. She was very active in mental health advocacy at that time. And then she started, asking me questions during the breaks about what I thought about what I had overheard during the meetings. And then eventually she started asking me to be a full participant. And I mean, all this started while my behaviors were at their most severe.
And I want to bring in the doctor in just a second here, but real quickly, when you started to hear kind of off-the-cuff diagnoses thrown around by people about the person accused of this massive shooting, this horrible event, when you started hearing labels put on him that are not confirmed, we don't know his history, what did that do to you? Because just that, how did that make you feel when you heard those?
I mean, we hear, off-the-cuff diagnoses at every tragedy, but the responses for this one, I mean, there have been some truly terrifying responses that are, I mean, there's no other word for some of the responses. I mean, I've seen people talking about how people with certain diagnoses should all be rounded up, how pages joking about how if they get enough followers, they're going to go out and find an autistic kid and burn him to death. I mean, this particular round has been horrible.
Doctor, that's scary to hear. What are the dangers in kind of armchair diagnosis in a situation like this? What have you seen in the past week that concerns you?
To make a diagnosis of a psychiatric disorder, you actually have to take a fair bit of time, attention, review of history, records. So I place no faith whatsoever in what's been said so far. Until there's a clinical review or a clinical record produced, I don't think that we can work off of, a sketchy third or fourth hand report. I've frequently done evaluations of people who arrive with a certain diagnosis because that's what someone thought they might have had 10 years ago. And then I take a look at them and I have a very different view of their condition. So I think one of the things that's important that you've done tonight is bring someone like Savannah on board, because Savannah represents the vast majority of people's experience, which is that people get better very commonly. And I think that's really one of the important things that you're doing tonight. Savannah's a great story, and I want to say thank you to Savannah for sharing your story. People can learn, kids can learn coping mechanisms, strategies to manage emotion. I don't know anything about this story, but it's obvious coping skills around emotion weren't part of the equation. And I feel like, unlike the person who was speaking earlier, the National Alliance on Mental Illness is quite concerned about access to mental health services across the country. We don't feel that access to mental health services is easy to get or routine or easy to construct. And so we have a crisis, a public health crisis around child and adolescent mental health. If you have a mom like Savannah has, and you have grit and determination, you can often do very well. But sometimes it can be difficult to find the services that you need, either in the school or in the professional community. And that remains a concern to me from a public health point of view.
Yeah, and if you're online and you're ignorant and you hear something tossed out there as a label for the individual in this instance that is the same label someone might put on Savannah, there is a wide range, a huge difference in what she's been able to accomplish and something else that's inaccurate in the first place.
If you meet one person, you've met one person. If you meet one person with bipolar disorder, you've met one person. If you meet one person with Asperger's spectrum or Asperger's syndrome or autistic spectrum disorder, each individual is a confluence of strengths, vulnerabilities, areas they need to grow, family supports, and triggers and risks. So the idea is to take each individual as themselves. Yeah. Looking at a diagnosis as an explanation for a phenomenal heartbreaking problem is shorthanded and is missing the fundamental point, which is that violence is a substantial problem in our society. People with psychiatric and neurodevelopmental vulnerabilities are a pretty small piece of that puzzle.
Dr. Kenneth Duckworth, thank you for your time. Savannah, thank you for your time and for your writings this week. We appreciate it. We're going to send it over to Ed now. Ed?
Thanks, Casey. Well, just like we heard from Savannah, your information, your personal stories are actually help frame tonight's conversation. So we want to hear from you. If you have questions for the community experts and folks that we have gathered here tonight in studio, we want you to go on the Facebook page of the 9 Network, and we put a question up there earlier. We want you to put the question you may have, and we'll incorporate that later on in the second half of our show. So please log on to the Facebook, the 9 Network.
Talking about you like you weren't here, but now you're finally here. We appreciate you sticking around. This is Tim Fitch, the Chief of Police for St. Louis County. And Chief, you were in the news a little bit this week because you said what maybe a lot of people were thinking, but you came out and said maybe it is time to talk about, as a last resort, arming our teachers or the principal or whomever in the school First, before we've got a lot we want to talk to you about, but first let's talk about that for a second. Explain what you're thinking there, and what kind of response have you gotten from educators on that idea?
Well, mixed response from educators. A lot of educators have caught me on the side and said, I know I wouldn't be allowed to say this publicly, but I think that's a great idea. I'm a teacher, I'm a gym teacher, I'm a whatever, I'm an administrator. I'd like to have that option available, because if somebody came into my school, and everything we're talking about right now that you've been talking about, all is about how to prevent this kind of activity. What I've been talking about is, now you've got it in your school, what do we do about it? So that's a critical time period, because what you have is, from the time the person enters the school, they're in, now the counseling has helped, they're in, they've got the gun, they're starting to shoot, and law enforcement's been notified. That gap, that critical gap, is what I've been talking about all week. It's 5 minutes, it's 10 minutes, it depends on the local police department's response time. I'm comfortable when the police get there, they're going to handle the problem. But what do you do in the meantime? And today we met with the educators, and there were things like, well, instead of guns, let's give our people tasers. Well, somebody said, let's put in a trap door so they could fall in a trap door. Like banks, let's get one of those doors that locks so they can't get out or get in. I mean, there were all those kind of well-meaning ideas, but I have to deal in reality. And reality is, at the time that I'm talking about, kids are dying. So what do we do about that? So one of the options I threw out there as a last resort, if you don't have law enforcement at the scene, is, do we give qualified people with the right training the ability to protect themselves and the kids in the school, to at least cut down on the number of deaths until law enforcement can arrive.
Do you worry about all those days they'll be in the classroom or in the school where nothing happens and they're carrying a weapon on them?
Well, that wasn't my idea, to carry a weapon on them. It was to have it secured. For example, you know, you're the science teacher, you're a hunter, you go through this training. There are certain kinds of devices where you can secure a firearm. We have them, you thumbprint to open it up, you know, things like that. But it's still readily available. It has to be readily available or it defeats the purpose. But it can't be so available that someone could steal it, for example. And by the way, those things happen. They steal guns out of police cars. I mean, that happens. But what you could do is give somebody a fighting chance, instead of all those kids saying, guess what, we're going to hide under a desk and hope nothing bad happens, they don't find us. I don't like the hope method alternative. That's the part that I've been talking about. So what I've said to those that are absolutely against that idea, absolutely against anybody, even if they're qualified to have a firearm, is, what's your plan when the shooting starts? And I haven't heard a good explanation yet. Throw books, throw chairs, I've heard all those type of things. That doesn't work when someone has an assault rifle.
That's a conversation that's going to continue, I'm sure. Let's talk about before that happens, and on a broader scale, how much people may not realize how much your officers interact, or how much of the work that your officers do involves mental health. Can you give us an idea on an average day how much your officers are interacting on a mental health level?
Every day. Years ago, funding was cut drastically, and it continues to be cut for mental health services. So all of these individuals with these mental health problems are out on the street. Well, who do you think has to deal with these people? We have to deal with them. They're sick individuals, and they're off their medicine. And we get stuck dealing with these instead of having the professionals deal with them. So we're stuck dealing with these issues. And then where do we put them? In jail. Mentally ill people, unless it's criminally mentally ill, do not deserve to be in jail. But that's the only place that we know where to take them.
So are your officers prepared for this in any way?
Well, what we do, we have special officers. They're called CIT officers, Crisis Intervention Team. They receive an extra 40 hours of training to give them some extra tools on how to deal with mental health issues. So they have this training. They're actually seen, when they go to these psychiatric centers, they're seen as fellow professionals by the experts there. They're able to get them checked in, explain what's going on with this individual, about the crisis, about any medicines that they're on, and then basically leave the individual, if they haven't committed a crime, with the facility.
Will they see that individual again? Do you see it?
Absolutely. We have gotten to the point now where we've dealt with the same mentally ill individuals over and over. They'll call the station and they'll say, I want to talk to Officer Smith. He helped me last time. They'll actually call for the CIT officers.
So real quickly, something called COPS. What would you like people to know about that program?
So about the Cops in Schools grants?
Yes.
What we had was, after Columbine, the federal government said, we need to put more cops in schools. So they had a grant program called Cops in Schools. Well, that funding ended in 2003. And a lot of school districts said, this is an important program, we want to keep it in our schools, so they started funding this. Well, a lot of school districts said, we don't have the money. So they let those officers go. They didn't want them in their schools anymore because they didn't have the funds. So what we're hoping will happen is Congress will say we need to come up with the funding to reinstitute cops in schools.
Chief Tim Fitch, thank you for your time.
Thank you,
Thanks for sticking around tonight. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Our final discussion tonight brings together, well, you know, sort of a dinner party group. We haven't brought in everybody from one single area because this is a topic that, as we've seen tonight, covers so many different areas. So we've asked Barrett Taylor back to the show. He's an educator, outgoing state rep Jeanette Oxford from the legislative standpoint, and maybe some other points of view. Diane Helton is a parent of an exceptional child, has Asperger's. You advocate for your child on Facebook. And Dr. Haller, Ken Haller, you're a pediatrician at St. Louis University Medical School. I guess I'm going to throw this out at you guys. After all of this discussion, what are the next questions from maybe different points of view? Where do you want to see this go? Diane, I'll start with you.
Oh, goodness.
Have to start with somebody.
Well, I guess the person that struck me the most this evening was Savannah. Because that's a kid, a scary kid, as she described herself. At some point in time, my son could have been described as a scary kid. He has Asperger's, and some of his behaviors are a little scary and have been in school. I mean, he's got quite a, as I said, a checkered academic career because he's only in the 7th grade, and he's changed schools numerous times, because this school didn't have what he needed, this school couldn't meet his needs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we've moved around trying to find the right fit for him. And I guess, you know, just listening to Savannah, I'm so happy to see a real person in this conversation. And not that these other folks weren't real, it's just, they have an opinion on the subject, but my son's lived it. Savannah has lived it. And this whole nonsense of the knee-jerk diagnosis, oh, they were mentally ill, or they had Asperger's, and that's why they did all these things. That bothers me so much.
Representative Oxford, you're shaking your head. I know you deal with children's health issues. Has there been a frustration in Jeff City on these particular things, or have you seen successes?
Well, there are things that work, but we often don't put money into them, unfortunately. We all say the right things about kids, how much we love them, and that they're the center of everything, but we often don't put our money where our mouth is. I was shaking my head thinking that the legislative session starts on January 9th, and so that means the new budget process will be happening. I've watched the budget being made since 1991, and every single year there's a crisis. There's not enough money. People come and testify to the legislature, pour their hearts out about the pain in their lives and in their community, what's going wrong, and the good work that places like Youth in Need that we're describing earlier, folks are doing good work. And if you could just give us a little bit more money, we could help more folks. Right now, only 1 out of 5 people that need mental health care through the Department of Mental Health are getting that health care. We have waiting lists and all kinds of programs. And every year we say, well, that sounds really painful. Who do you want us to cut so that we can fund your program? And we don't look at anything that would increase the size of the pie, and they're very common sense things that we could do to increase the revenue in Missouri so that we could fund these programs.
Barrett, as an educator, how does this discussion proceed from here? You know, we started out saying, is Newtown just something that's going to be a piece of history, or is it going to have an impact? Will we feel more than just the pain and sorrow from this? And from an educator's point of view, where would you like to see the discussion go? Not a solution necessarily, just the discussion.
You know, when these things happen, it seems like I always hear people say, you know, why? Why does this happen? But we never talk about the antecedents. And one thing that I've heard people talk about tonight is history, this culture. And I think, unfortunately, in America, we have a history of violence. And I think before we can move outward, we need to look inward. And this is a great time right now to look at ourselves and say, what have we done as a people, as a culture, to perpetuate some of these things that have happened? You know, I was thinking about like video games. Like Call of Duty. You can go buy video games and just shoot and kill people for hours on end. Little kids do that. How does that affect people?
Okay, I want to thank everybody. We don't have enough time, but thanks everybody for joining us, and good night.